In this video, we're going to pit an 11-year-old camera, the Panasonic GF1, against the iPhone 11 Pro. Can the iPhone beat the GF1, or is this super old camera still capable enough? Let's find out. I know what you're all thinking. Why? Well, the past few years we've been constantly hearing how good cameras and phones have become. But are they really? Whenever I shoot with my phone and then go edit the images on the computer or the iPad, I'm always a little bit disappointed from the lack of details and overall image quality. The iPhone 11 Pro is considered a very capable camera phone, but it still showcases the same problems as all other mobile phones. Painterly details, lack of details overall, and so on. I've never sat down though and really test an actual camera and a phone side by side, so this video is just that, testing how capable a phone actually is. It's obvious that the iPhone, or any other phone for that matter, cannot really compete with modern cameras, so for these tests I picked the Panasonic GF1. Now, why the GF1 specifically? Well, first off, it's the only really old camera I have in my possession, but most importantly, because it's relatively similar to the iPhone's specs. Both the iPhone and the GF1 produce 12 megapixel images. The GF1 has a micro four thirds sensor, which is bigger than the iPhone's, but it's not as big of a sensor when compared to other cameras with APS-C or medium format sensors. And since it's an 11-year-old sensor, it's not going to be as efficient as newer micro four thirds cameras like the GH5, the camera I'm using to record this video. So whatever gains the bigger sensor might have, it's trumped, in theory at least, by the newer technology and software coming with the iPhone 11. So let's start testing things out. Let's first start with the most ideal scenario for a phone, a well-lit environment. As you can see, there's plenty of natural light here, so the small sensor on the iPhone is not challenged at all. I shoot RAW on the GF1, and on the iPhone 11 I shoot with two different formats, JPEGs with a native camera app, and RAW through a third-party app. Now let's see how things look in Photoshop. When opening the pictures, I'm disabling completely all the options in the Details tab, just so we can evaluate the image without any adjustments. These three settings are there to reduce the color and luminance noise that every image has, and to also help with overall sharpening. These settings can make an image look really clean, and because Photoshop has the individual profiles of the GF1 and the iPhone 11 Pro, it automatically applies the right settings for each camera. But since we want to compare the images in their unprocessed state, we'll set these three to 0. We will first compare the two RAW files. In this scenario, it's quite difficult to tell which is which. Both images are very close in quality. There are some telltale signs, but I'll let you choose first, and then I'll give you the answer. So the left image is shot with the GF1, and the right one with the iPhone. Here the iPhone's minimal depth of field works to the image's advantage. Everything is super sharp and detailed. I would say almost to a fault, but in some cases sharpness is really needed. On the GF1 I shot the image with an f5 aperture, so things look a little bit softer compared to the iPhone, but we can always bump up the sharpness by adjusting things in post. So if I apply a sharpen filter to the GF1 image, you will notice how close things are to the iPhone. Doing it in post allows us to set the amount of sharpness ourselves, instead of being locked to a sharp result from the very beginning. Sharpness aside though, the images are very close in detail. Color-wise, I prefer the GF1 since the images were shot at 7:30 in the evening, so colors are closer to sunset, but in either case the colors can be adjusted to our preference, so let's not pay too much attention to that. So when it comes to RAW, the iPhone is doing a good job here. If we now load up the image shot with the iPhone's default camera app, which does its own processing and bakes everything into JPEGs, you will notice the differences right away. The highlights on most of the objects and the wood are gone. The processing in itself is not bad, it gives a lot more dynamic range to the image, but I would argue a little bit about the actual quality of the colors we end up with, especially on the screwdriver. But overall, the processing of the image is good enough. My main issue though is the fact that without the highlights, the image feels a little bit flat overall. But no matter your preference, I would say that the iPhone is doing a great job here, and it's extremely close to the quality of the GF1. Unfortunately, this is the last time you will hear me say that. Our next few tests will paint a bigger gap between the iPhone and the GF1. For the next test, I chose an indoor scene. This is where things are getting a little bit more challenging for mobile phones. Indoors, the lighting is usually not the best. Both the GF1 and the iPhone perform quite well when shooting in RAW and native ISO. Yet again, I'll let you choose first, and then I'll tell you which is which. Here, the left image is coming from the iPhone and the right from the GF1. GF1's colors are a little bit colder, while the iPhones are a little bit too warm. I would say the GF1 captured the white balance a little bit more accurately. Either way though, the white balance and colors can be adjusted relatively easily in post. What is interesting here though is that even in the native ISO, the iPhone is giving noisier results. If we look at the tiles, it's obvious that the iPhone is trying a bit harder than the GF1. It also feels like the GF1 produces a more natural image, partially because it's a cleaner image overall, but mostly because of the softer details and the depth of field and color reproduction. But both cameras do quite well in this scenario. If we try to bring up some sharpness to both images, we can see that the iPhone's noisy image gets even more noticeable. So with the iPhone, we're kinda stuck when it comes to processing the image. There's little things we can do before the image starts breaking up. But overall, I would say the iPhone delivers a good image. Now let's see what's going on when we shoot the same image with the default camera app. This is where things go crazy. When I shot RAW with the iPhone, I had the ability to choose a low ISO value so I could keep the noise levels down. This of course means that the shutter needs to remain open for longer. But because the default camera app wants to avoid shooting blurry pictures, it tries to keep the shutter open for as little time as possible. So in order to compensate for the little amount of light coming in, the iPhone needs to increase the ISO to 320. And this is where the results are not as flattering for the iPhone. Tiny sensors are not good in high ISOs, so images tend to be very noisy. When things go even more wrong though is how the iPhone decides to process the image. Because the iPhone wants to deliver a very clean picture, it gets very aggressive with the noise reduction. As a result, the image looks very processed, and if we look closely, we get the familiar smudging and painterly look we're used to from mobile phone cameras. Because of the heavy noise reduction and the overall noise coming from high ISOs, the image lacks detail, so the iPhone is trying to further compensate for that with very aggressive sharpening. As a result, the image looks artificial. Look at the lid of this jar on the GF1 and on the default camera app. On the GF1 we have a very nice, smooth and realistic result. On the iPhone image the result is very patchy and painterly. Even the RAW image from the iPhone looks better compared to the one from the default camera app. The aggressive sharpening is also very visible on the fava beans. Just to prove to you how aggressive the sharpening and processing is, let's try to replicate that on the GF1 image. I'm going to open the camera raw filter and just go to town with the noise reduction and sharpening settings. The end result is close to the one from the iPhone, but because the GF1 produces a cleaner image from the very beginning, the final edited image is still better than the one from the iPhone. If we now apply a more reasonable sharpening to the raw iPhone image, we get a much better looking picture than the heavily noise reduced and sharpened image from the camera app. If we put aside the iPhone image from the default camera app and just compare the raw image from the iPhone and the raw image from the GF1 has the advantage. The image is cleaner, the colors look more natural, but a tiny bit more red, and because of the depth of field it feels also a little bit more pleasing. So that's the indoor scene, a lighting condition that is not as perfect as an outdoor scene, but also not extremely challenging. And let's see now how things go in extremely low light conditions. As you can imagine, it's not going to be pretty. Here we have a really simple scene. The image is shot in complete darkness with only a small light source lighting the books. Let's first compare the raw files of both cameras. I know what you're thinking, but if you shoot RAW, you won't take advantage of the iPhone's amazing night mode. Don't worry, we'll get to that. Let's first check the RAW files. Both images are shot at ISO 400, and like before, when opening the images in Photoshop, I disable the chroma and luminance noise reduction. As you can see, the GF1 produces a much cleaner image than the iPhone. The text is clearly visible, and other parts of the image, like the parts of the page that are not perfectly lit or the wooden floor, they are much cleaner in the GF1 than the iPhone. Now let's see how clean we can get the images if we process them the way we would normally do if we were editing the images. I'll apply some sharpening and I will enable noise reduction in both images. The noisy iPhone image is still noisy, but we got rid of the excess noise that made things look quite harsh. No matter though, it's still a noisy image. I try to reduce the color noise on the iPhone as much as possible, but at some point we will start losing color information, so I try to go as aggressive as possible but without compromising the image. It's a whole different story though on the GF1 cam. With just a tiny bit more processing, the image now looks quite clean, and we can probably sharpen it even more to get an even sharper text. The GF1 image definitely allows for more processing overall. As you can see, there's no real comparison. The image from the GF1 is cleaner, has more detail, and it retains more accurate color information. This is where the bigger sensor of the GF1 really helps. It might be an 11-year-old sensor, but it's still capable enough when compared to the tiny iPhone sensor. In my effort to balance out the results, I shot one more image with the GF1 at double the ISO. So that's ISO 800. The image is of course noisier than before, but it's still much cleaner than the one coming from the iPhone at ISO 400. If we further apply noise reduction and sharpening, we can get a very clean result even at ISO 800. Even with double the ISO, the GF1 image is much cleaner. Now let's put the iPhone's night mode to the test. Unfortunately, the results are really bad. Here the processing goes into overdrive. At small size, everything looks relatively fine. It looks like there's detail retained, but once we zoom in, we can clearly see what's going on. The image is heavily sharpened to the point that the detail of the image is compromised. The text is more readable compared to the RAW shot with the iPhone, but if we take a look at the illustration, the night mode is making things quite worse. The wooden floor panels look like they retain some detail, but the effect is so intense it kinda looks wrong. Editing the images for final delivery further shows the iPhone's issues. The image cannot really be processed any further. Things will start breaking apart. The exact opposite happens with the image from the GF1. It's much easier to edit, and it's quite easy to push the image to the look we want to get. So, what does all this mean for mobile phone cameras? When we have the perfect conditions like plenty of light and using the phone's faster default lens, then a mobile phone can deliver similar results to an 11-year-old camera. Things though quickly go sideways for mobile phones when we deviate from these perfect conditions. In these cases, an 11-year-old camera can easily beat today's mobile phones without even breaking a sweat. Does that mean mobile phone cameras suck? Well, yes and no. I would say it's very impressive that this tiny device is a powerful computer that also happens to shoot pictures and really nice video. But at the same time, don't expect a multi-purpose device to compete with a camera whose only purpose is to shoot pictures. Basically, any cheap camera from the past couple of years will run circles around any mobile phone. For example, you can buy a used Panasonic G7 with a kit lens that approximately gives you the iPhone's lens range for around 300 euros. It will give you much better pictures than anything you can shoot with a mobile phone camera. And this is coming from a 5-year-old camera with a small micro four thirds sensor. Things will be even better with APS-C sized cameras and around the same amount of money. One important thing to note here, in all these tests we just stuck with a more capable and faster default iPhone lens. If we tested the other two lenses, the results would be even worse, something you wouldn't really see in a dedicated camera. As long as you use nice lenses, your results will be consistent and with the added bonus of real depth of field. What I'm trying to say is, don't believe the hype. A mobile phone is an amazing all-around device, but don't have any expectations about cutting-edge photography. Of course, the best camera is the one you have with you at all times, and in this case, a mobile phone is definitely the best camera. So, if you just want to stick with your phone as a camera, what can you do to get better pictures? Just shoot RAW, like always. Forget the default camera app and just buy another photo app that shoots RAW. The default camera app just does a lot of processing that gives you this painterly looking images with heavy noise reduction and sharpening applied to them. It's better to control all these things later in post rather than relying on decisions your phone will make when shooting with a default camera app. It won't be as convenient or as fast as shooting with a default camera app, but the final result will be 100 times better. I've shot some of my favorite images with my phone, but in most of the cases when I have to choose between shooting a photo with a camera or a phone, I will always pick the camera. Of course, it's much more of a hassle carrying around a camera no matter how small it is, but the results speak for themselves. But of course, you decide what works best for you. What matters in the end is how good your composition is or how interesting this subject matter is, not how clean or technically advanced your camera equipment is. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.